Thanks for watching another AGR videocast. We're grateful to our listeners for watching, taking time out of your day. The efforts here on Abounding Grace are meant to help you. Our goal at Abounding Grace is to help people understand the Christian ministry, the gospel, and in the Christian walk, what is God's will for us. And today we have a special guest, David-Bahnsen. So great to have you, brother.
Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. Of course, Dan-borvan from Christ Reformed Church in Anaheim, always our regular. So grateful to have both of you here to have a good discussion on some really important issues. First off, maybe, David, just tell us a little bit for our listeners about yourself. I see you all the time. The other day we were in my kitchen and all of a sudden you popped up on the screen. So we see you frequently on the news networks, but just tell us a little bit about yourself.
I live 3 weeks a month right now in New York City and 1 week a month in Newport Beach, California, so about an hour and a half north of here, but have mostly been born and raised in Orange County. Well, born in LA, but raised in Orange County. And then 8 years ago, my wife and I went bi-coastal, and so my business has offices in both Newport Beach and New York, so I go back and forth and have kids on both coasts and activities on both. But I work in finance, run a national wealth management firm called the Bahnsen Group, and it's not just a coincidence that the name of the company is actually named after my last name. And we have 10 offices around the country now and manage over $7 billion of client money. And I have a whole lot of theological, cultural, political interests that I get to go on TV or podcast or what different forums talk about. When people see me on TV, it's generally on the news networks talking about some element of the economy.
Sure. Yeah, it's been very helpful. And by the way, fight on.
Well, fight on. Yeah. So
my wife's a USC grad, so
yeah.
we love the football.
Yeah.
And I read that about you, so I didn't realize you were that devoted to
Yeah,
USC.
well, it was sort of my late father did his doctorate at USC. I was born up there, and I was raised just a diehard Trojan, and so when he passed, just as I was kind of college age years. USC football became like the major way in which I kind of held on to a lot of those memories with him. So I went to a lot of football games with my dad, watched a lot of football games with my dad, and then I don't miss USC football games. So that's about the only thing I do for fun.
It helps when they win.
Yeah, it does. It does.
So we loved your book. What we'd like to do today is discuss your recent book, Full Time, Work and the Meaning of Life, which we found very helpful, thought-provoking, and lots of good stuff there. And then we'd like to talk a little bit about your father, who Dan and I were just commenting. We watched the Stein debate ahead of time. Again, we'd watched it years ago, and well, we felt like...
I assume you mean you've listened to it.
Did I say watch?
You can't
Listen.
watch it.
You can't watch
Yeah.
it.
Unfortunately.
It was from the 90s, right? So
1985.
85?
February 11th, 1985.
Yeah, we listened to it on YouTube. It was fabulous, and we think he crushed him.
We're unapologetic Greg-Bahnsen fanboys in terms of apologetics.
Yeah, that would be a pretty universal view about that debate. I've never had someone say, "Oh boy, Stein really got the best of your dad that night," including Stein. I have a lot of correspondence from him who he was very down on his own performance.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Threatened to sue to keep us from releasing it.
Wow. Really?
Yeah.
Well, it was wonderful. So there was a lot to take in there. So what we'd like to do, we're pastors, and we both pastor in Reformed churches, and we thought your book, and because you're a pastor's son, so that gives you a unique perspective, I think, in light of your view of the kingdom and the church and work of the pastor. And you had some really good things to say there, strong things to say. I really appreciated it. I think those are good challenges for us. We're going to get into some of that. We don't like to have. I think at one point you said in the book that we're sort of entitled to. Pastors are kind of entitled in light of their time, and there's some really good stuff there. We're going to unpack, but let's just begin about the book. Why did you write this book? Why was this book so important for you? It seems like this was sort of so far the crown of your work.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yes. In a way, I mean, in terms of the day job of finance and economics, capital markets, entrepreneurship, and then my strong passion for a sort of better Christian theological understanding of business and risk-taking, this would seem out of that lane a little bit. Now, I believe that all of the things I do, you mentioned Greg-Bahnsen, I just believe that everything is a byproduct of a worldview that I have, and I was raised this way, and so I don't really view any vocational endeavor as separate from theology. And so people, one of the most common questions I get is, how did son of a Christian intellectual or philosopher or apologist or pastor become so involved in finance? It's such a separate deal. And I don't think that it is. I think one was engaged in foundation setting, and I'm more engaged in building on top of that foundation, but I view it as all part of the same kingdom building process. Now, this book, it essentially is, there's sort of two questions. Why did I write this book? And then why did I write it when I wrote it? Because I always wanted to write a book on the church's errors in vocational theology, but particularly the application of how work is preached and understood. Because I basically went through my 20s utterly shocked to find out that in the Reformed church world from which I came, where I felt the theological foundation was there to get this right, that it wasn't applied, or in my opinion, that there was this constant skepticism. Why does David work so hard? So in my formative years of my career, even before I got married and into my young married life, there was never a time where I felt a real companionship on this topic in my own tradition. But then as my world kind of expanded over the years, I realized this is systemic in a much broader mainstream evangelical context as well, that there was a really flawed view that had permeated the megachurches of American evangelicalism. And that bothered me throughout my 30s a bit. And so there was always this thing in the back of my mind that one day I had some stuff I wanted to say, that I could see myself writing a book, but I was doing a lot in this subject before I wrote the book through various faith and work ministries and whatnot, just trying to undermine them, like subversively get in and pretend I was one of them, but then sort of blow it all up by saying, here's what we really ought to be doing, and do it with a lot of civility and charity and common ground and all that. And I thought a lot of those efforts over the years were effective. But I never felt that the world was that off on this subject, meaning American, I hate the word secular, but American secular culture. I always thought like the DNA, like I constantly criticizing the church for playing catch up to the world, which is what I think is basically what it's almost always doing. But this is a case in which I felt like, oh, the country's playing catch up to the church's bad theology on work, because the unsaved culture was mostly, from our DNA, a pretty pro-risk-taking, pro-entrepreneurial, pro-hard work, environment. And there's always been some class warfare and there, whatnot. But I mean, we celebrate vocational success in our country. Not always for the right reason, not always from that same foundation. But my point being, you'd have to look in the 80s and 90s, you'd have to look to find someone that was broadly opposed to a pretty robust view of work. And it was the COVID moment where I realized this is not now just merely a 25-year theological hobby horse of mine within my church background, but this phrase, non-essential worker, I lost it. To this day, I hate even saying those words. I find them so offensive and undermining to a healthy human pathology that I cannot believe we formulated public policy around the phrase non-essential worker. And so it increasingly became evident to me. I agree with a lot of the general diagnosis in society. I think we are becoming more unhappy, that there is more tribalism, there is more alienation, there is certain mental health, drug abuse, alcohol, depression, these antisocial moments are really intensifying. But where the fundamental disagreement is that time and time again, I'm being told from writers at The Atlantic that make $400,000 a year writing magazine articles that our big problem is work. And I believe the solution is work.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's gets kind of to the thesis of your very book. And what that thesis, I think, when you initially said it at the beginning part of the book, you knew it would generate some. You could sense it in your writing. By the way, it's interesting. People sit down and want to write a book. They say, "What do I want to do? I want to try to find a book." And in many cases, and I felt that with your book, it just kind of wrote you. It just is, in other words, this was something that you were not only passionate about, but it was easy in the sense that you captured a problem, you knew what to say about it, and it just flowed.
Well, I'm glad you were able to detect that from the book. It was not a book that I had to figure out what I believed on the subject as I was writing it. Now, I still wanted to properly organize the book and articulate what I had to say. But yeah, there wasn't a lot of soul searching that had to go on. But, I think you're going to get to it. The chapter 9 on pastors, that was one that I very much sent to others for accountability because I did not want to be overly harsh or cause offense. And I made some of my Christian accountability partners tell me it was okay before that got included in the final draft that went to my publisher. But yeah, the rest of it did kind of flow from things that I'd been wrestling with for a long, long time.
Well, we're pastors and we didn't take any offense.
Okay, well, I think it was a good challenge.
It was a really good challenge.
Yeah, we need to hear that. And we'll talk about it more, but yeah.
So the main thesis, state your main thesis and unpack that for us.
Well, the subtitle of the book helps give it away. When I say work and the meaning of life, I am suggesting that work is the meaning of our life, and I'm defining that in the context of creational theology, that I believe that God, before the fall, made mankind to be in communion with him, and that embedded in the Emmanuel principle of God being with us is that God will be with us as we are co-creating. Being an image bearer of him means that we are working. And the vision that has sort of been adopted over the years post-fall, and certainly in modernity, is that there's a certain segment of the population that's really good at work, and then a large segment is not, and we're all supposed to accept that economically, socially, structurally. There's just producers, and then there's just not producers, and that's okay. And
so there is work before the fall.
There's absolutely no question there's work.
Work itself is not part of the curse.
Work is absolutely no more part of the curse than children are.
Why have so many Christians missed this?
Because they would love for it to be true that somehow the curse to Eve, the Eve part was okay and the Adam part was not.
Right. Yeah.
That's the reason.
Yeah, of course.
They'd love to be at home playing with their kids and not have to go to work.
Right. Yeah. And we would love to say work is the curse, but it's not. The ground is cursed. Our work is now more grueling, but you're right. There was work before the fall. Right. God places Adam in the garden to work and to tend it. And I think we all believe there will be work in the age to come.
That I most certainly do. I'm not sure that we all believe it. Because that's come up over and over.
Here.
Yeah, the three of us do. But I think even a reasonably mature and well-intentioned Christian, I think the imagery one gets. See, I don't ever know a day in my life I wasn't a believer. And so I can only go back to like when I would learn about heaven as a kid. But I think I would love to talk to adult converts about this. Because maybe it's only children. I think most Christians have a visual of heaven that pictures a church service. And not a city.
Yeah, no, that's right.
And I think heaven's going to look more like Midtown Manhattan than what most of us have in our heads.
I'd rather it be Newport Beach, frankly.
Well, there's Celestial City, but you can have ocean running by your streets paved with gold. But
yeah, but you had a really good example. I mean, right at the beginning of the book, you say, my image of my father in the study, working early in the morning with joy. Right. Oh, yeah. And loving his work. Maybe it's just the free range parenting that we grew up with. I don't know. But like, I don't, there's something to having that good example and being taught that and being programmed in you that, I think there are generations, our generation, we're almost the same age, right? You're about 50.
I turned 50 last year. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm 47, you're 45. I look back at our time being raised, I don't think there was a lot of discipline in the home on these things. So you have a peculiar blessing. It's a little more challenging for those who weren't trained well in this. You read a book like yours, it's very stimulating. It's very motivating. But sometimes you feel like, if I wasn't trained real well in a good work ethic, it's hard to sort of get there. You have to make real adjustments in life to program yourself to think this way and then to act on it. So the application is really important. And I think for some, it's like, okay, I want to do this, but it's a challenge. I've never seen it modeled well.
See, I think it's more than just the work ethic. And that's what I'm trying to allude to with my dad was it's the work attitude. Because my dad was a baby boomer who modeled a work ethic, as a lot of baby boomers did, and a work attitude, as a lot of baby boomers didn't. I think that the legacy of a lot of hardworking boomers was work hard, and you better work hard too. And they're modeling it and they're teaching it. That's all good. But complaining all the time or holding out the purpose of work as so I can retire. And so my dad had a tremendous joy about his work in addition to the hard work, both of which I really grabbed onto from a very young age. You know, the other piece is just sort of coincidental or logistical things was my dad always had a home study where our church never had a 7-day-a-week campus. So it was always a renter of Sunday facilities. And so my dad's study was never away from the home. It was always in the home. And he taught at schools and other things. But like I saw him every morning when I woke up, every single morning.
It's powerful.
And it was. And when I say didn't complain, there are things in his life and career that were very hard for him. Like he had denominational struggles we talked about a lot as a teenager. But that's different. He did not complain about the work. He did not complain about being a pastor or a writer. And really, like I say this sometimes, I feel guilty. I don't feel guilty, but I know where the temptation to guilt comes from. I make more in a week than he ever made in a year in his life. And my dad worked as hard as I do for a very insignificant economic benefit. That's the part that I can't get. There's a lot of people that are very driven in their work but have tremendous socioeconomic incentives. He didn't. He just loved the work and the calling.
I love that point in your book about the hierarchy in society of how we view work. You know, I look at my mechanic. The guy's a hard worker. He's brilliant. He can do things with his hands that I just stand in awe of what the guy can fix. He makes a meager salary, but he works hard. And I think you're right. We have this hierarchy of work that then devalues the mechanic, the plumber. And I appreciated that point in your book.
And I try to make the point because it was one thing I was very concerned about that I knew where I came from. I knew my life story, but I also know a lot of people go look at the book and say, David's this corner office guy in New York who has money. Like, I don't care about hearing it from him. Where my view is, ironically, the reason we have this sort of snobbish or view of work that it leans into a socioeconomic strata is because we don't have the theology right. It's my view that makes no distinction between the value of the work to God between a plumber and a corner office partner at a law firm. It's our secular society that's determined that the market value of the work and what it does to impress others, that status is where the value of the work comes from. That's not my view. But it's hard because I'm a messenger who does have a vocation that carries a certain socioeconomic strata. And that's why, like, you notice each chapter started with the jobs I had. And you know, the very first one was I was mowing lawns, you know, and that was a byproduct of just me asking my dad in 1985 or 86 if I could have a Commodore 64 computer. And he said, you sure can. How are you going to pay for it? And I'd gotten, and that was the very first thing I ever did for money. And so kind of just walking through that chain of events. But I got to a point where I had to be comfortable with the fact that, you know, where I am financially is not the point. I believe the things I believe about work, regardless of how the market values the work. Now, I would say for the mechanics, plumbers, you know, they have some real good days coming, in my opinion. I think that those who work with their hands and those who work in the trades are in the midst of a big economic resurgence of value. That we have there's a supply-demand imbalance that is going to hurt certain service workers that are unnecessary in the economy and help certain trades that are very necessary in the economy. But that's a separate point.
Yeah. People are going to learn what jobs actually are essential.
They are.
Pretty soon.
They are. That's right.
And the laptop class might not be as essential as they think
or
they are.
Or certain elements of it, yeah. And there may be some of those jobs are essential. You know, like I would use the easy example, like 2003, 4, 5, 6, the mortgage brokers. Well, mortgage brokers are essential, but not that many of them,
Right.
right? It's a supply-demand balance thing, and we seem to be very underweight on certain welders and overweight on other parts
All
of the
the trades,
laptop.
yeah.
So what factors, we've talked a little bit about it, but what factors do you think have produced this terrible attitude toward work in our society?
Well, I believe that the undermining of the message out of pulpits permeated the rest of society. And when the church stopped leading, that it kind of pulled apart the whole thing. So the question I have to kind of start with is, how did this start in the church? And my kind of simplistic and, just to save time, quick view of it is, like many things, early 20th century retreatism was the genesis. I do not believe that America through the 19th century, leaving the moment of the founding, the kind of Puritan and Pilgrim DNA, through the Tocquevillian high community, high work vision of early 19th century America, for the next 100 years, I do not think that the church at that point had retreated from a high view of work and entrepreneurialism and risk-taking. And there is a reason the Industrial Revolution was a global phenomena, not a domestic one, and that our economic growth was significantly more robust than European and Asian and other countries who participated in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in America was attached to entrepreneurialism, work ethic, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But the kind of three major spheres, and we could come up with others, but I think you look at education, politics, and the marketplace, and that the church in the early 20th century decided in the face of modernism and Darwinism and other isms to play a role of retreat and surrender. And that in the later portion of the 20th century, they got second thoughts in politics and education, but not the marketplace. That more or less, regardless of what people think about how the church reengaged the civic sphere, nobody can deny that the 80s and 90s were a period of the church deciding, like, okay, we don't like the way this is going. We no longer believe in the retreatism that had dominated American thought in the church. The pietism, fundamentalism, and sort of surrender approach of the mid-20th century persisted in the marketplace. It obviously didn't in education. Tens of millions of kids coming into homeschool movement, Christian school movement, classical school movement. There was a big, it didn't exist in the 70s. The 80s, 90s into the 21st century became a really robust endeavor. But then I think what happened is, as a lot of evangelicals were achieving certain success in their jobs, they were reasonably embraced as upwardly mobile, largely white-collar professionals, that the church said, okay, well, there's a need to resource them to some degree, but it didn't come from a theological foundation. It didn't come from reading Kuyper. It was, let's get a Bible study together so these guys don't have the same temptations at work. Let's at least let different Christians that have achieved some, success have a prayer breakfast or have a networking opportunity. So they'd get together once a month on a Thursday morning and pass out business cards, have coffee together, pray together, all good stuff. But it was never about re-engaging the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And then I believe pastors have been systemically afraid to preach on it out of a fear that it was going to undermine other Christian priorities. That theology of kingdom, wrongly in my view, prioritized family and church over marketplace, and therefore, why preach on the fourth most important thing, if that, when we just need to do all of our preaching on the second and third most important thing?
Yeah. And just tangentially, what has driven me mad about evangelicalism in the last 50 years or so is you almost have to baptize every vocation. So you can't be a medical doctor. You have to be a medical missionary. You can't be a school teacher. You got to work in a Christian school. Yeah. Every vocation has to somehow have a Christian adjective to it. Otherwise, it doesn't really count. Like, you can't really be a finance guy. You need to be a Christian finance guy and work only with Christian charities.
But there's only two reasons to do that, and both of them are really bad, and I'll let you tell me which one you think's worse. One is rank grift.
Yeah.
Marketing. And by the way, not marketing yourself, marketing the name of Jesus.
Right.
And the second one...
And we can't be naive and think that doesn't happen.
Oh, it's systemic. But the second one, which sometimes is even ambiguously correlated with the first, is more well-meaning, but it's just theological naivete or ignorance.
I think so. I think for many, a charitable reading to go with the naivete is they don't understand. They don't have a robust doctrine of vocation.
But its dualism is number two. The issue that is outside of grift and marketing and running a hustle is that kind of Jesus fish stuff on the business card thing people make fun of. Some of it's grifty and some of it's dualist, but both things I think are problematic. And that's a big subject of the book is the dualism that got us to this point.
Right.
So you mentioned the fear in discussing work. One of the sort of fears you think behind, and I think it's interesting. I appreciate your view toward helping the church and pastors to address this important subject. I agree. I think we both looked at it and said, there have been fears of us over time not addressing work properly because you mentioned in the book, maybe we'll muddy up justification by grace through faith alone. It's like, that's just so, to me, foreign. Like, why would I not be able to talk about, or Heidelberg talks about the importance of good works. By the way, I loved your application of Ephesians 2.
Yeah.
I think that is, I wish
that was the Ephesians 2:10 exegesis was new for me in the research of the book.
I love
that. That translation was a vocational word for work and not a sort of esoteric idea of Christian charity. I did not know.
These sort of what you were just saying, we have this idea that the works need to be super spiritualized, right? Yeah. And that was really helpful to be able to say, I said it, by the way, you've already influenced me. So I said to the congregation yesterday, I was on Heidelberg, Lord's Day 24, why do we do good works, right? And I addressed this very point. I said, listen, this is not just talking about super spiritual works as we think. Yeah. Your vocation matters.
Yes.
Like go out this week, serve God through your vocation, and your great emphasis, serve others in that. There's a benefit to all of society in that. I think that is spot on, and I think we do need to emphasize that more.
And I think that one of the things I'm trying to criticize in the book, and one of the things I'm sensitive to, where a lot of people come and tell me they love the book and agree with it, but I know they don't, is that
we're not doing that.
We're all on the same page here theologically.
Yeah.
But some believe I really want a more robust view of work, more service to others because of this transactional thing that will happen from the work. And that's where I'm trying to push back a bit is that when we leave I don't think that many pastors will even say that. Go work hard even for these transactional benefits. But if the fundamental message is this sort of Great Commission utilitarianism, that's not the message of my book.
Right.
Yeah, and if I said... I was thinking when I was developing my thought. So what if I said tonight, God didn't design you to work the first half of your life to go have a 30-year vacation.
Yeah.
What kind of offense would I immediately bring? Right. Like I just was anticipating, should I say, I have no problem saying it. Like I have no problem saying it. But you do kind of have to reprogram people on this because it is so ingrained to us. This is the trajectory of life, and that's why I think you were going after halftime, right?
You guys must both engage this all the time. It's newer for me, where as pastors, you're dealing with a macro principle, but then there's micro discussions. In other words, you're giving a principle that's biblical, but then a real person with a real context comes up to talk about their situation.
That's right.
Yep. And so when I make a comment about retirement, I've done 163 speeches and interviews on my book so far, and every single public event where I talk about retirement, someone's come up to me afterwards to tell me, well, I'm retired, but just so you know, I really do this and this. I'm all, Mr. Smith, it sounds like you got it going. You're okay. But because there's a defensiveness or whatnot. Right. But I'm talking about macro principles, and even like the issue where people want job advice in the Q&A. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, well, you want me to have a robust view of work, and this is my calling and what God wants in my life. But what do I do? I'm stuck in this thing. And I said, I can't do this from the stage. I could give a lot of really good professional advice when I'm talking to Billy or Don or, a person on their situation. But the macro thing is difficult for me to distinguish.
It's hard in the pulpit.
It's got to be.
It is. Everyone comes with this context and they hear it a certain way. And it's a real challenge constantly. I think that's why Jesus said, take heed how you hear.
Yeah.
You can process your own context and then not hear the basic principle that's being laid out for you.
But that goes back to the episode we had last week where we were talking about when we write sermons, we think of specific people in the congregation. So even when we're doing the macro, we have in mind that micro context as well.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Well, that's fun. That's good to hear because I certainly have certain people in mind on certain things I was talking about in the book as well. I just don't use their names when I'm on stage.
Right. Yeah,
but,
we don't either. We shouldn't at least.
Yeah. But think of the office of elder. There's sort of this general view in the church that, listen, I put in my time in the younger years, which elder means older, right? And so in those prime older years where they have all this wisdom, and you talk about this in the book, in the workplace, the wisdom of the older person who's accumulated wisdom, who makes wise decisions, he's lived life a long time. We have this challenge in ministry that most older men say, I've put in my time, I'm done. Even for service in the office in the church. So this is a challenge to get people to rethink their very purpose and meaning of life, especially in old age, which is something you develop.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree. I haven't thought of that specifically in ecclesiastical context, but I think that the same exact principle applies. It doesn't seem like a very controversial one in Scripture, that there is this benefit in wisdom, in expertise, in experience. And so why, whether it's in a vocational or professional context or what you're referring to in church office, why we'd want industries entirely run by people who've never done it before is just completely outside of my ability to understand.
Yeah. One of the thoughts that came to mind is we've been living as pastors through this great identity crisis in our culture, with the whole sexuality thing. People are searching for identity. They want everything's been identity. Carl Truman's book dealt with this. And he even talks in there, about work, how his father would have viewed work if you asked him. I think it was grandfather or father. It wouldn't have been if he said, are you happy or are you fulfilled in your vocation? He said, what do you mean? I'm providing for my family. Right. Today, we have a variety of different options with regard to work. But let's park on this identity crisis thing. Everything seems to be about personal happiness in terms of identity. And that, I think your thesis is really helpful to this whole identity crisis in the church and in society, to value work because you tie together work and identity.
And there's a sense of achievement that is a verb. And so when we talk about work and identity, I don't know what one wants their identity to be disconnected from the things that they do. And so this study that I share a lot because it gets an audience laugh, but it's also really quite sobering, is that American public school scores are substantially down in reading and in mathematics and in every academic discipline, but they're higher in self-esteem. People feel better about being dumber. Okay, but see, what is it we want in our identity disconnected from work? We want to just simply have some greater mark, generally social strata, that is not connected to some way in which we served others or built something. And that is, to me, so I always say, you go to extreme analogy because God did not make every one of us to be Michael Jordan. God didn't make every one of us to be Michael Jordan in our own field, whatever our equivalent to the world of basketball is. We all can try. We all should try to, no, but my point was, when it's an absurdity for one to pretend that when they close their eyes and think of Michael Jordan, they don't think of a basketball player. And you know why? Because Michael Jordan was a basketball player. Right. And so we can all play cute stuff around it, like, well, God didn't make him fundamentally a basketball player. He most certainly did. And he has a soul that will never die. And there's an interiority to Michael Jordan. There's a moral context and accountability. There's a covenantal reality. But what I'm saying ontologically, the being of Michael Jordan is connected to basketball.
And he rebelled against that and tried to be a baseball player.
He did. Disastrous. And even then, just when he thought he was out, they reeled him back in, only to win 3 more championships.
I'm glad I'm from Chicago, so that you talk about the glory days of my life.
Sure. Yeah. But is that an extreme example? At the end of the day, our identities disconnected from the things we do are a fallacy. And I believe that's different than salvific conversation, and I believe that the work of Christ on the cross is we're talking about a theology of redemption. But when we're talking about personal identity and people trying to solve for who they are, and they want to disconnect that from what they do, it is an incoherent pursuit. Right?
And this is theological. This goes back to the image. The image of God is not just being. It's not just who we are, created in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. It's doing. We're created to take dominion over the earth. So this is rooted theologically. This is not just some psychological explanation or whatever. This is our very being.
The anti-work movement thought they had come up with something real adorable with this line, I'm a human being, not a human doing. And to which I simply say, you are a human being. And what does it mean that you're a human being apart from what your human doings are? Right. And so I use the positive example of a real, obviously, elite performer, Michael Jordan, but the inverse of that, are you supposed to believe that sort of proverbial 30-year-old who's laying on a couch smoking pot all day playing video games, that's the exact same thing as someone who's up and serving others and working hard and building and creating and coming up with solutions to problems and overcoming challenges? Those two things we're supposed to think of as the same thing.
And there's something fulfilling about serving others. We don't ever talk about, but it's really important to say. I mean, we know this when we're narcissistic, and there's a narcissism here that's just terrible. But when we're focused on ourselves, we're serving ourselves, it's kind of miserable.
And that's the ultimate privilege. Like, I'm here, celebrate me. Well, what have you done?
Yeah. Right.
Right. But it's a vanity that it has no staying power, and where this sort of earned success comes from, it does. I think it is pro-cyclical. You continue to have your needs met by continuing to meet the needs of others. There is personal achievement in it. There's service to others. There are rewards that come from it, which are very biblical, and you're modeling something to others. But also you're living up to the creation mandate. You're literally building civilization.
I really appreciate, you talked about the dualism. And we've been, especially we'll get to Christian nationalism in a minute and some of the Stephen Wolfe discussion.
Sure, that seems like a direct tie-in here.
Oh, believe it or not, I have the tie. But what I was saying was, there's an emphasis on sort of being a pilgrim, an alien, a stranger through this life. And if you we've emphasized that on Abounding Grace Radio, and we got major pushback that you guys are just, Gnostics. And I think your thesis here is the solution to that. In other words, we believe strongly in a strong vocational, creational theology that gives us meaning and purpose through work. So I want people to hear us, because people, like we were talking earlier, everyone gets pegged into a certain camp and viewed a certain way, and then we can't even talk to each other. I appreciate that about you, by the way. You are able to sort of tear down some barriers and talk, especially in the reform world where we rip each other apart in ways that is unhealthy. The way we attack each other without being able to sit in front of each other and talk about these things. Yeah. Here I can say we are in full agreement with david-bahnsen on this, that we have meaning and purpose, and we're not just twiddling our thumbs, looking, doing nothing as we wait around to head to the heavenly bliss. Right?
Yeah, and I think that there are reasons where some of those disagreements will come from, but oftentimes they're not theological disagreements that are leading the way. It's a point of emphasis, like I have this strong belief in Christians being excellent at what they do, and others would not necessarily say I'm against excellence.
Right.
But what they would say is my tradition really wants to focus on evangelism and soul winning and all of this lawyering and agriculture and technology and finance and business building gets in the way of evangelism. So there is a theological issue, but they've kind of you have to highlight where the difference comes from. Yeah. And in the Reformed background that I highlighted as me realizing, I think my own tradition rooted to Calvin, rooted to the Reformation, rooted to Kuyper, this is supposed to be table stakes.
It is.
Where does that disagreement come from? Right. I think it's a comfort zone for pastors.
Yeah.
That they are going to go continually preach week after week to people that spend an inordinate amount of time with their wives and children about the danger of not spending enough time with your wives and children.
And this is what many people aren't aware of or don't want to acknowledge, is that The Reformation, it's the doctrine of vocation that changes the Western world. Of course, it's the recovery of justification by faith, theologically, spiritually, but the doctrine of vocation is what changes the world when work, normal work, not the clerical work of those behind the walls of the monastery that was genuine work, but those common workers, when they saw that work was valuable unto the Lord and they should make a good shoe and sell it at a fair price, that's what changed the Western world. So this is our history.
So anti-dualism.
Exactly.
Priesthood of all believers. We're core to the Reformation. Yeah. And changed the world.
Yep.
I totally agree.
Yep.
And your quote of Sayers, I mean, what should the Christian carpenter go do? Build good tables.
Yeah.
it's a great quote. That's a great
when
quote.
She said it, I think it was in the 1940s, and she was saying that the pastor is content to ask that the person not come to church, not come home drunk, and not and be at church on Sunday. So there was a sense of pietism, like we want people to behave, and we want people to attend church. These are important things, but then that was good enough. That's what we're after. And what she was saying was they fundamentally need to be building good tables. That I want you to not be drunk because it's wrong to be, and because when you're drunk you can't build a good table. So there's this whole sort of reinforcing mechanism. I think a lot of the fault I have with fundamentalism or pietism on this is that if they got everything they wanted, I don't know what we do next. Mm-hmm. If we're living obedient lives, good husbands, good fathers, coming to church, in a good place of worship, in a good place of Christian fellowship, and we're not showing up at meetings drunk, and then that's it. I'm not sure what it's all for. Mm-hmm. Those are all things to maintain the disposition to do something in the kingdom. And what is that thing? Is the thing we do. In other words, like there's a thing sober people will say a lot, where the sobriety is not the goal. It is the necessity so I can go do the goal, right? Like I can't behave as how I'm supposed to if I'm messing up in these other areas of my life. But once you kind of have those things as a general understanding, what is it you're supposed to be doing? And that message to me was always clearly known. I'm supposed to be growing the kingdom of God through these various endeavors. And everyone has a unique calling. We're made as individuals. And for some people, it's in different domains and fields. And but that thing we're supposed to be doing it towards, I never heard preached on. Mm-hmm. Other than to warn people against it. Yeah. Other than some sort of cautionary.
As an idol.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, though. There's a godly discontentment that's part of our being. Yes. And it, again, goes back to Adam. The garden wasn't in a static state. Mm-hmm. Adam was to expand the kingdom to the ends of the earth. And so there's a godly discontentment that we all have. Of course, it can turn into an idol, but a godly discontentment that we want to do more, produce more, build more.
Well, God made the world with scarcity.
Right.
And God also said in one of what a lot of Reformed Christians' favorite verses is, to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And so they will use that verse as a bumper sticker for having a bunch of kids. And I'm all for having a bunch of kids. I'm sorry, that's not what that verse means. It is certainly not the limit to what the verse means.
Well, and then there's a post-fall context now that sin's entered
that's right.
too. But
that particular verse is pre-fall. Of being fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And that the people could ever interpret that verse as merely procreative and not laborious and civilizational and creative and productive, I think is really limited, truncated theology.
Yeah, that's helpful. Let's back to the creational, you talked about proportion of work and rest, 6 days, rest the seventh. One of the things that I think, this is just my thought, I know these things, there's a pattern here that runs together. So to overemphasize one or the other, but Sabbath, you gave some attention to it.
I did.
And I think that's important. Our experience as pastors is the Sabbath day seems, I mean, you look at churches across this land, across denominational lines. It used to be a morning and evening worship service. Mm-hmm. It didn't matter if you were Baptist, Presbyterian, whatever. The evening worship service got dropped, and now we have a very low view of Sabbath, like, in my opinion. Like, there's just, so I guess my question is, how does the loss of Sabbath in the American church affect productivity? in 6 days. So if you're not resting, it seems to me these things run together. Do you see any correlation to the abandonment of the Sabbath to the current work, what you call pandemic?
Yes, but my entire point is that there are two normatives in that commandment, and we undermined one so we could undermine the other. I don't think that we have a low view of Sabbath because we're working too hard.
No,
we have a low
right.
view of Sabbath
Right.
because we're undermining the 6 days shalt thou work.
Right.
Now, even a lot of the folks in my Sabbatarian tradition that have always focused there's a kind of Puritan tradition on Sabbath.
Yeah.
I very rarely heard people refer to the 6 days shalt thou work part as the normative part.
Yeah, right.
And I think it was an important part in my book to reiterate that I do believe in the model of creation, that the purpose of the rest was so we could work. The purpose of the work is not so we can rest. And I think a lot of Christians get that backwards too. Some even disagree, but that is my very firm conviction. But what has happened in ignoring Sabbath rest? Are we all working too much? Or instead, do we have a bunch of 24-year-olds that want the boss to bring in yoga class to the middle of the office?
Right. So it's a
Right. We have an absurd view
Yes.
of it because we have ignored Sabbatarian.
and priorities of what people are actually doing. I mean, this is really important. Everyone claims to be busy today. I'm so tired of that. Like, we're all busy. We're all busy. Everyone says I'm busy. Well, why are we busy? Is it on the right things or the wrong things? Right.
And by the way, I have absolutely no desire to be insensitive to people who have lost a job, but I'm talking in a macro context here.
Right.
I remember profoundly in October 2008 when they announced that Citigroup, which had 250,000 employees, was laying off 50,000. And, you're laying off 20% of your workforce, but your financial firm is essentially on the verge of insolvency. So 20% doesn't seem that high in those circumstances. But I remember thinking, what in the world are they going to do? 50,000 people being gone. Our ATM machines aren't going to work tomorrow. Banks, mass closings. Yeah, everything was fine. Next day, the world just kept on turning. And the great astonishment of the post-financial crisis era was not that unemployment hit 10%. It's that it stopped at 10. Because of all these people that are so busy, there's an awful lot of people that clearly, productivity has not gone up. So we invented this little thing called the internet, and somehow it didn't make us more productive. Now, the reason is that we are more efficient, and the internet has been a massive economic game changer, but we figured out how to do the same with less, as opposed to getting more done. But I agree. I think most of the time when people talk about being too busy, it is a byproduct of creating a narrative for themselves that is defensive.
That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right.
And even pastors.
Even pastors.
And that's the only one I actually focus on as a very specific case
Let's
study.
talk about that.
Yeah.
This interested us a lot.
Yeah.
I said at the beginning, we really appreciated this. I think it's good for us to be challenged. I wrote a chapter on how to evaluate your pastor in a book, and I got major pushback.
So can I start this by asking you a question?
Sure.
Did you detect in that chapter, my critique of pastors' work ethic in chapter 9, that I was writing to two audiences of pastors, the reformed pastor of a small church and the mainstream evangelical pastor of a big church? Because I don't think those are the same criticisms in application.
I agree.
Right.
But I do have criticisms of both.
I read it in the macro sense.
Okay.
Of you're painting general trend problems that you've noticed that have affected in a negative way the whole thesis of your book. Yeah. So I think that's helpful because and we appreciated this. I said earlier, you're a pastor's son. You have a particular view of how pastors actually influence people, society, culture on these things. And it's a very important influence. So I appreciated that.
Well, and I think some of the, one of your challenges is only relevant to the sort of evangelical megachurch pastor, or at least a quote unquote successful pastor. Page 169, where you say the time pastors spend in their own pulpits has plummeted in the last 25 years. Yeah. Well, a guy who's in a farm town in Iowa with 50 people, he doesn't have the ability not to spend time in his pulpit.
So is that farm town in Iowa pastor, he's still preaching 50 weeks a year?
I think in many cases those guys are. Okay. Yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah, it depends on
I'm
your
encouraged
context.
to hear that.
Right. It depends
they
on
just
your
can't.
context.
They can't take time away. What are they going to do? They don't have three pastors on staff
and they
to
don't
fill
have,
in.
and they don't have a hub of guest preachers coming in and out all the time.
So why did you how did you? I put that comment up because that to me is I've always thought this, David. This is a big issue. Pastors need to be among their flock. Pastors need to feed the flock. They're sent to a certain flock. And this is their primary responsibility. We talked about in the last program about all the duties of pastoral care, ministering to the sick and dying, bereavement visits, all those things are very important. But that primary feeding of the flock is so important. I've always thought we have seen in recent times a devaluing of the pastor in his pulpit as a primary source of feeding the sheep. So where did you come?
Well, that devaluing has often come from the pastor who has said, my primary role is to be a visionary, not a shepherd.
Now there's the event. I can't imagine.
That's an evangelical.
It's an evangelical thing because we have elders around us. And
but it creeped into Reformedville from the success of Tim Keller.
Yeah.
And it was never something that Tim Keller did wrong. It was something that many people wanted to be Tim Keller did wrong. That's my view.
This is what we discussed on the last program. We've got all these vision setters, and they build such huge platforms, and they become the untouchables, and it's not healthy. It's not.
They don't usually even do that very well, but what they're trying to do is not healthy. I agree with you entirely.
Yeah.
But that's why I mean that distinction between. I think that there's this really hard work ethic for a lot of pastors at big churches. I think they're working very hard. And I'm critiquing what they're working on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's different than some of the smaller church pastors where I don't think their problem is vanity or that they're trying to run a boardroom versus a congregation. I think their problem may be, whether it's too much time on the internet or just not blocking and tackling.
Yeah.
And so I did say in the chapter, like, I'm conscientious of avoiding projection or a sort of self-pity in my defense of my dad. But I don't mean like I felt my dad was doing it the right way and all these others were doing it the wrong way. I did not know until I was a grown man that there were pastors that preached 20 times a year. I didn't know. At 25, or that when they preach 30, they're bragging like I'm actually in the pulpit more than half the year. And so I won't get into particular names in my own journey, but I had a couple pastors that would preach 25 times a year, half the year.
Where can we get that job? You get paid full time for half-time work?
All you have to do is leave your denomination, and I promise you'll find it very quickly. I'm not talking about an outlier.
Wow.
You're the outlier.
See, and
it's
that's
totally
important.
systemic.
Right. That's important. Wow. That's important. Because I put that comment up and somebody immediately in a very, very small sort of Dutch, cultural situation, it would be unthinkable for his pastor to be outside of the pulpit. And that's not, listen, you're right. That's the outlier.
And so those cultural contexts matter too. And it's funny, last Thursday, I gave a big talk on full time to the New Canaan Society in Midtown Manhattan. And I've spoken at a couple really large events to Christian business folks in New York. And it's a different message because you're not talking. And that's why like Keller's ministry he was not talking with all these people like, are you smoking pot at your mom's couch until you're 30? No, you're not. Not in New York City. That's not why people go to New York City. So it's a different context. And I'm sure that's true of the pastor. You said the small town farm in Iowa. But what I'm talking about is a little bit different, but it does all still come back to the same general point of, is the pastor's message on work to their congregation impacted by wherever they may have a flaw in their view of it? And I think that
direct correlation to how the congregation will be trained in their own work ethic.
And so there's a number of different problems we could go after, but they're all important to go after. The celebrity pastor culture has to be completely blown up.
It does.
Amen.
It's just done unspeakable damage. But see, I'm in a weird position because a lot of my Reformed friends that want to go after it, they want to go after the guys who became celebrity pastors, the first gen. That's not my critique. My critique's the copycats.
It's the guys in line who want to fill the void of the guys dying.
Yeah.
And everyone's vying, seems
power grab for
that. There's, it's interesting. I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Years ago, there was at West Cal, there was the Dindolk lectures, and I can't remember who was speaking, but it was an old wise pastor. And somebody asked him, they said, well, what has been one of your biggest challenges in the ministry? That's a big question, right? And he stands back and he says, all my free time. I never knew what to do with it.
Wow.
I was stunned. Like I was training for ministry and I heard this and I thought, all your free time. Like what does that look like? What does that mean? All your free time. The reality is we're not clocking in, clocking out. We're kind of always on call. That's true. But there's a lot of free time you have that you can waste. Mm-hmm. And I think the discipline in the pastorate, I think this is an honest assessment and something that I think it's healthy to think about. So when I say, believe it or not, the problem is that we have too much time on our hands. What do you think of that?
I think that it's so hard for me thinking about my dad's church that didn't have staff. And where now there are different degrees, even churches of 200 people all the way to the big, large churches, the level of free time that one may have to do with the other resources they have available. And I'm not against churches having resources and staff and so forth. But I think that the old cliche about you want to get something done, give it to a busy person to do, is that there are just people that find ways to be productive and people that don't. Mm-hmm. And that heart of a pastor, that's like the type of people I want working for me are people that like are never bored, because if they do have all their tasks done, they're proactively creating new work. How could the minister of a congregation ever not have something to do?
That's right. That's right. But
until they've achieved that sin-free status and psychological health and spiritual health throughout their church.
And not only for you, but for the whole congregation.
Right. And then even then, I would like to think some pastors spend some time thinking about people outside their congregation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I know evangelism is not always what Reformed folks are after. But I'm allowed to say it.
Should be. You can say it.
Yeah.
But it's true. I think we are busy, but I think we can be challenged on the busyness with a wrong set of priorities. Yeah. And I think that's important to your point. Yeah. And I appreciated that. I don't think you were being overly harsh on pastors. I read your section as really trying to have us think about those right set of priorities and giving ourselves to them.
And I think that is universal, not only for the megachurch pastor, but also for the small church pastor.
Yeah.
Kent Hughes wrote a book, was pastor of College Church in Wheaton for many years. He wrote a book 20 years ago, Liberating Ministry from the Success Syndrome. And this was the era when it was all, don't lose your family as a pastor. Mm-hmm. You work so hard, you're gonna lose your wife and kids. Your kids are gonna grow up without a father, orphaned by the ministry. So they swerved so far to the other direction. He said there was some survey, and they surveyed guys actually kept track of their hours. Pastors kept track of their hours. They weren't even working 40 hours a week. They were so paranoid of the opposite that they were lacking in their vocation.
And that same dynamic, that pendulum shift from one extreme to the other, I think is largely what I feel has happened from pulpits into the work endeavors of the congregation.
Right.
That I don't doubt there's been some role in which someone said, and certainly this was the thing Keller struggled with in Manhattan, was to a lot of high-achieving young professionals, often pre-married, that have the right context for their church life and their home life. I get it, but then that pendulum going the other way becomes a big problem. The other piece to this, to me, that strikes me as unfixable is, how do you solve for how hard a pastor is supposed to work before you solve for what they're supposed to work on? Mm-hmm. And so I've had I won't say names. I remember talking. He was actually a URC pastor, a very, very good friend of mine, who was saying once, I asked him about another pastor friend of ours, and I said, "Is he a good preacher?" And he said, "Oh, he's a wonderful pastor. He's not very good at preaching." And I thought that was like a runner who's really good at taking a shower after the like what does that mean? You this is sort of a core part of the job, exactly. I think. But a lot of pastors, we're not talking again, not in our reform world, but in the broader evangelical world, calling on people in the church. Mm-hmm. How many pastors know the names of the people in their church? How many of the congregants have talked to the pastor? That piece is so out of control in the last 25 years. Yep. We had mega churches in the 80s and 90s, but it's different now. Mm-hmm. It's just different. So I don't know that you really can fix the issue of how hard a pastor is supposed to work until it's addressed what they're supposed to be working on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was thinking one of the things that really helped me with your book is that pastors at times go through seasons. There's a lot of spiritual warfare to this, a lot of difficulty, and I thought about your challenges and think, might it be that pastors at times get bored with their calling? And it shouldn't be. This is the most exhilarating calling. Your dad's imagery of him joyful in the office working is something we need to always set. But I remember an old pastor saying to me, whenever I started to feel like that, I had to challenge myself and start reading again. And then I thought, this is a really important point. Like, one of the great responsibilities of our work is to grow for the benefit of others. So when we give ourselves to read and to study, that's not a self-serving, it shouldn't be, effort. It's actually giving ourselves to our work for our own growth that then carries over to the congregation.
And so that parallel is what I relate to because, first of all, I think it's kind of normal in the Reformed tradition that a heavy view of Christian scholarship is viewed as a good and noble and positive thing. And it was my dad's, legacy. He absolutely loved Christian scholarship. But for myself, I do a significant amount of writing as a financial advisor that stems from a significant amount of reading. And so when I'm doing the intake, it blesses the outtake.
Yes.
Like it feeds
That's right.
this inspiration of constant new ideas, new thought, new intellectual stimulation. And this is probably going to come down to one of these things where we're talking two different conversations between the Reformed world and the Evangelical world. I mean, do you think all these evangelical pastors read books?
They read the 5-Minute Manager.
Some sort of pop psychology,
right.
self-help,
Yep.
corporate kind of gobbledygook.
Yep.
Yeah. I had a ministerial here at the church, and the pastors walked in. None of them really had a study. So it's like, what are you reading?
I know this. I've talked to them over and over, and every time I get a chance, I ask, "What are your favorite books?"
Right.
And they will usually name a C.S. Lewis book they read in college.
Right.
And by the way, I love C.S. Lewis, and I loved reading him in those ages of my life.
Yeah.
But no, that I do not believe that in the broad evangelical world, they could even take what you just said as an example of, if I have free time, I can go into my study and do scholarship, because I don't think they value reading books.
Right. Well, and it's so crucial to us is what we do.
I can't even conceive of that.
It's what we do. And I think it's important that you are making that distinction between, sort of the evangelical world and what the Reformed world. There is a difference.
I have criticisms of both, but they're different criticisms.
They're different criticisms. Right. And it's true. We do need to be more hands-on in the sense of getting out and visiting the flock, caring for the neighbor, those sort of things. That's important too. You can't just be buried in your study all the time. So
yeah, in a way though, here's the thing, I guess, if we want to now pick on our own a little bit, is I think that we all seem to have shared feelings about the concern we'd have in the evangelical world, but there's a lot of vocational excellence in these big evangelical churches. There's a lot of professional, elite, achievement and hard work. And in a lot of the Reformed churches where the theology might be better, and even the pastor's own scholarship and work might be better, there can be a bit more, I think, systemic level of mediocrity. So what is that disconnect about? And that's what I ultimately decided, both from my own, kind of my adult years, 30 adult years of exploring it and experiencing it, was that it is basically a disconnect between the theology of the Reformation and the application of it in today's Reformed pulpits.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's very important. You mentioned Steve Jobs in the book. That was interesting. So he was quite a figure.
No, sure.
Quite a figure, but he didn't sort of have this Christian worldview.
No, he most certainly did not.
So you mentioned earlier, just kind of pick your brain on this. So you don't like the word secular, but he obviously had a secular kind of work ethic that really did.
No, I don't. I think he had you mean his motives or the work ethic? I think he had a Christian work ethic that was completely, totally removed from a Christian foundation.
There you go. That's what I want to. I want you to comment.
Wrong premises, right conclusion.
Yeah. Right.
But then even then it gets a little disordered, because my view of Christian work does not mean you ignore your daughter or deny she existed. Or, Steve Jobs was not a great guy all the time. Yeah. Right. But in that particular case, we could use Jobs. We could use a million examples in the unsaved world. The unsaved world,
right?
I'm an antithesis guy.
Yeah. I like Kuyper.
It's very Van Tillian of you.
Yes.
I think Kuyper's misunderstood. I've said this to Doug. I said it to Stephen Wolf. I love Kuyper had brilliant insights on all this stuff.
But I think that I know what people mean when they use the word secular.
Yeah.
But my opposition to it is only my anti-dualism.
Right.
But in the unsaved world, Jobs. If someone says critique Steve Jobs, the last thing I'm going to critique is that he worked hard or that he built the most successful consumer product in world history. I'm going to critique other parts of his own life and decision-making, I suppose. You know, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what kind of dad Steve Jobs was, but my point being I'm aware of the fact that there was some negatives in his pathology. But what I would say is that we could just bring it down because we're not going to meet a lot of Steve Jobses in our lives, and you're not going to have a lot of Steve Jobses in your congregations. But if you're witnessing to someone and they become a believer and they were a drug addict, you have to tell them to stop doing drugs. You have to say part of your new life and my discipleship of you, I need you to realize you have to give up this bad habit. And whether it was pornography, drugs, alcohol, there's certain sins that people have to let go of. But if you have someone in your congregation or that you witness to and they come into your congregation, they become a believer and they were an elite performer in private equity, do they have to give up their career?
Yeah.
But that's the way we talk about it, as if it's the same thing as their past in pornography is the same as their past in business. Now, the foundation changes. By the way, it should give a whole new, almost kind of majestic context to the beauty of the work now that they're a believer.
And fulfillment.
Yeah. The more peace and joy around it. But that's what I mean by the Steve Jobs thing is I'm not critical of how hard he worked. I want there to be more Christians doing what Steve Jobs did.
Yeah.
And for a Christian to do it, they're not going to go through all the, abandonment with their children, or all the other negative things that could happen. But I don't think I quoted this in the book, but I've quoted it a lot in speeches. But Bill Gates in 1990 was interviewed by Fortune magazine. And so in 1990, Bill Gates was a very wealthy guy, but he was not worth $100 billion. And Windows 95 had not come out yet, whatever. Microsoft had technically been a public company a few years. But Microsoft 1990 was a big deal, but nowhere near the big deal it became. And Fortune interviewed him. He was single. He had not yet married Melinda. And they said, Mr. Gates, you're worth $100 million. But you famously sleep on the couch, have pizza boxes laying around, are still working as hard as you ever have. If I were worth $100 million, I'd never work another day in my life. And Bill Gates looked at the Fortune magazine reporter and said, that's why you'll never be worth $100 million. And I took that shortly after my dad died. I took that magazine article and framed it. And I had it on my wall for years. There was that mentality that, well, once I have a certain dollar amount, I don't need to work anymore. This is what people don't understand about the Musks and Bezoses and Zuckerbergs, none of whom are believers.
And the Home Depot. Well, I mean, he's a believer.
Well, he was. There were two. There was one who was a Jewish fellow and one who was Catholic. But look, they're not working to make their next billion. There's an achievement complex. They want to build something, do something. I want more of that mentality in believers. And it's not megalomaniac and it's not autocratic. I'm not looking for them to go build the next so we can get a spaceship to Mars thing. But there's this entrepreneurial DNA that I wish were systemic in the church that I don't believe it is. And I think that that's a theological frustration. That when a believer achieves a financial success, they don't have to say, yay, I can provide for my family for a year. They can say, yeah, I can provide for my family for a year, and I just built something, and now I have the capital base to go build something else. Which
is another solution to the sort of masculinity crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we've talked about this before.
The inverse correlation between the masculinity crisis and vocational achievement is unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's a perfect inverse correlation.
It is. And, we see the generation, what you discussed and some of the trends were shocking in the book.
So they all want to put pictures of themselves on social media weightlifting, and they're all real proud of their conditioning. Do you know a lot of people that are real accomplished in their jobs that are sitting around posting pictures of themselves at the gym? Yeah. Now, most people I know work out and they're healthy. Yeah. They just don't spend a lot of time talking about it because they're too busy building Google. You know what I mean? So it's just it tends to seem to me to come from a certain inferiority complex.
Yeah. So this is a solution. What your book is a solution on so many fronts to the problems we're facing. And I think, how does you know, we've talked on Abounding Grace, coming back to the masculinity thing. You know, we see a lot of guys that are into pornography, they're into sins. And the first thing you say is go build a fence. Get up, get out, and go build something, right? I mean, I really appreciate that. That's exactly right. You need to be productive again to get out of this narcissistic web that you're in.
Is this a pastoral observation that a lot of the sins that are somewhat systemic are a byproduct of idleness?
Well, that's another of my questions. Like you have 2 Thessalonians 3. It's a whole chapter on idleness. The warning against idleness, right?
I'm an open book about everything. I haven't had a drink in almost 12 years, and there was a time in my life I was drinking too much, so I stopped drinking. And I'm telling you that the big temptation I had for drinking was that I hated not having something to do. And whenever you're drinking, you had something to do. And I believe I've never struggled with pornography, but I know a lot of people have. But this idea that we want young men to now go get their jobs and they stay at home all day working and they're not going to get married till they're 35 because you don't get married till you're financially secure. And they're going to stay at home and they're by themselves all the time. And a lot of them don't have jobs. That level of idleness, I can't relate to the thing on the pornography side, but it certainly makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that and these are extreme sins, I suppose, but they're very common, lust and alcohol and other bad habits. I think that one who's engaged in useful, productive activity as God designed the human person to do is far more insulated from the temptation of those sins.
Amen. I think that is such a crucial, I hope our listeners just heard that. Like this is a solution to the sort of irresponsibility that we see of people who are, you know, unproductive in society, stuck in sins, webs of sins. What you just said is a solution.
And this goes back to what we mentioned earlier, which you said with alcohol even. The solution is not stop drinking. The solution is don't drink and love your neighbor. The positive aspect of the law. It's not just the negative aspect, don't do this. The flip side of every one of the 10 commandments, the whole law, is then love your neighbor in these ways. That's how we escape the bind of these sins.
Yeah, that was one thing that I really benefited from where I thought about, like, if I used to think that there was something so grown up and mature and achieved, successful, that after working real hard doing a lot of things, you go sit at the bar for hours. But like if I just sat there with just drinking Pellegrino, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Get out of that. And so the amount of time I spent in hotels traveling, and I used to close out the hotel bar, and now I've done nothing but go back to my room and read and study and work and write, or this other thing called go to bed. You know, like and you know, I wake up at 3:45 every morning. I couldn't do that when I was wasting the time. So it isn't even just the alcohol; it's just the wastefulness of just if someone was sitting there drinking Pellegrino, they're not loving their neighbor, they're not growing, serving, producing, doing other healthy things.
You have to replace the bad with the good.
Absolutely.
And again, it gets to your whole chapter on, you know, what are we trying to achieve here? What are we trying to do? A few other questions I think we wanted to kind of pick your brain on. Well, what about, I mean, anything you want to ask?
Let's talk retirement. We have danced around it. So what
everyone's still listening, waiting for the Christian-nationalism stuff.
We're going to get there. We're going to get there. That's why we're making them go through all
What
this
is the proper approach to retirement? Not I work so hard and then I have the last half of my life just to play on my boat. What would you say is a biblical creational approach to retirement?
Well, I think we have to first start with some historical context that the concept of retirement as we understand it in 2025 in America, it is brand new. That essentially less than 100 years old. And that's why the baby boomers take off flack here, because the retirement was death.
We see that with Social Security, 65.
Well, that's right.
When the average lifespan was 67.
That's right. There were demographic and financial realities that have structurally changed, and we should be grateful that mortality expanded and that prosperity expanded. We live longer lives and we have more money as a society. That's a good thing. But that's the only reason we have this word called retirement. And so if what I were talking about is the idea of financial freedom, then I am not down on it. I am a big fan of people having financial freedom and flexibility from which they can do other things. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to ask them to do other things. But my point being, the flexibility that comes from greater financial resources is a good and biblical thing. But if what one means by retirement is that day in which I no longer have to work, there is a logical, inescapable thing that was said, that retirement is the day I never have to work again, means the reason you were working was to get to retirement.
Yeah.
And so we have really defined work as that thing we do so we won't have to do it anymore. And that is a horribly unbiblical idea. But even outside of the Christian world, it has done great damage to our society, economically, socially. These are not happy guys.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I can't imagine their wives are always that happy either.
Okay,
Space, go back to work.
I interviewed in a little podcast series I did when the book came out, General, was it Millington? Millington is the CEO of Wounded Warriors. He was a 2-star general for 35 years. And he just works and works and works even after leaving the military. He said, I told my wife, I married you for better or for worse, but not for lunch. and so, yeah, I'm all for people having more flexibility, and there should be more time with grandkids, and there will be more time. And if they used to golf once a month, and now they get to golf once a week or whatever, I'm not here to nitpick on it. It's just the frame of mind that says retirement is where I'm checked out. It's not healthy.
Yeah.
So what would you say to, okay, let's take the coal miner.
Yeah.
Let's take the coal miner who, a lot, it's interesting, a lot of people don't think, and I don't think parents help their children through thinking through what their future should look like and giving them guidance and help and their vocational abilities and skills. So a lot of them just do what their parents did. Right? At least it seems in history. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but a lot of them go into... I think
that's changed a lot in the last generation or two. There's a lot that now very consciously don't want to do what their parents did.
So this is what I want to ask. So in the past, that was very common.
Yeah.
I don't know what else I could do. Dad was in the coal miner pit. I'm going to go do that. So
again, I want to interrupt Pastor Olin to say that was not, in my opinion, we've learned that wasn't a cultural thing. It was an economic reality. It came from the lack of mobility.
That's what I'm saying.
The lack of dynamism.
Right. Okay. So that being said, what would you say to the person who is in that position? Because your book kind of assumes, in many ways, a freedom to be able to pursue whatever people want to pursue.
It does. It does.
Right?
I'm asking people to not hold in disdain or contempt this gift we have in a market economy.
Okay, very good. I think that's a really helpful comment for people to hear. But what about those who don't feel that liberty and feel stuck and feel really a lack of? Now we can critique this, we can challenge them. That's what this is all for. But they're really struggling to love their work. They can't wait to be done with it. Or, and I'm thinking of the past here, but even the example that Truman raised, my grandfather would have said, what do you mean do I love my work? Am I happy? I'm feeding my family.
Yeah.
But it didn't necessarily mean he loved what he did. And he looked forward to the day where he wasn't heading down so far in the ground. Right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people still like that out there.
Sure.
What kind of advice, what do you say to that person?
Well, you guys, the version of the book you have here is the one that's been out the last year. And so there's a whole bonus chapter in that I wrote on that very subject, because it's such a fair question about the message of full-time to those who view their work as a dead-end job or it's not going anywhere, and the kind of more practical advice. And so the publisher's putting out a paperback of full-time with this 3,500-word bonus chapter where I address housewives and homemakers, but also this subject. First of all, just again, that macro versus micro distinction. At a macro level, I want to make sure that we're talking about people bringing their right attitude to work, not that they have, and then distinguishing between jobs that are stepping stones towards other jobs. So if someone says, I just put a thing in a box all day, I want them to understand what they're doing, how they're serving humanity and putting that thing in a box all day. But that's different from a person who says, I'm sweeping floors when I'm 19, because you're sweeping floors as your continuing education to expand your horizons, to have different opportunities in the future. So the dead-end job versus entry-level job is not the same thing.
Right,
yeah.
right.
And we kind of commingle that in a way that's unhelpful. But to the extent someone has a job that doesn't give them a lot of satisfaction and it's the best paying job they're going to get, let's say, What the attitude they bring to it, I think, is very important. And then just recognizing that you do your work well enough. Do you want to pursue a side hustle? Do you want to stop at Starbucks on the way home and think about another business? Or do you want to do your work so well that maybe your boss does entrust you with more opportunities? There's so many different ways in which you can go. The thing where I thought you were going with this was that coal miner on the retirement subject. Yeah. Because someone who takes a shower before work every day is in a different position than one who takes a shower after work every day. And when my back doesn't hurt at the end of the day, and the coal miners did. I do think that's a very fair point. And I don't want cops that were chasing bad guys to be doing that when they're 72.
Right.
But they might be consulting at a security company, or they may be mentoring young police cadets or something. There's a blue-collar physical labor deal that's going to be different later stage of life. And I don't have a micro answer out of my macro principle for every person, but my macro principle is still, I think, very helpful, which is they should be doing something that's useful and productive, even if they're still not working at the coal mine.
Yeah.
Very, very helpful.
And we've counseled people on this in our churches. Okay, just because you're not working the 9 to 5 as you're able to retire, you still need, whether you want to call it work or not, you still need a task, especially men, whether that's woodworking, you're building tables in your garage, whatever. You still need this task that you're producing. You're building something even in retirement.
So much of it is solved for just simply by answering what it shouldn't be. Because it's not a mystery what Madison Avenue is marketed. These retirement homes that are built, they're just filled with everyone going to. Everyone's going to the bar.
The villages,
which is just perverse.
They had STDs running rampant.
Did you read that article?
Villages. Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
So you know about
unbelievable.
This.
What are they doing down
as a
there?
Case study, and I know some things that I will get into now that are just. It's a frat. For 68-year-olds.
Right.
And basically that whole vision was sort of this self-glorification in the baby boomer ethos. It was secular humanism run amok. And that's where I start, is your vision of retirement, you golfing and drinking all day. Let's just start with what it isn't and then work backward from there.
Yeah.
And I think some people are still going to go in the office. You mentioned Home Depot. So Bernie just... When you look at Ken Langone, Bernie just died, Bernie Marcus. Ken Langone is someone I met on a number of occasions. He's well in his 80s. It's not just that he still is working every day. He gets up and puts the suit and tie on every day. And he will, on occasion, have lunch at the same place around the corner from my office in New York where I hold lunch meetings a lot. He just gets up as doing meetings. And I think he's going to live till he's 134 because he's just still going that way. That's not necessarily going to be for everybody, but I think just still getting up and being engaged, and it's going to look differently for different people.
Yeah. Let's go to the front end of life then. I appreciated you saying you swept at the movie theater. My first job was below minimum wage. I think it was like $4.25.
Well, $4.25 was minimum wage.
Okay, no, it was $3. They knocked me back. It was $3.60. Now I don't know how they got away with that.
I don't either.
But they
you might have a class action suit on your hand.
I was undervalued as a worker. So I was washing cars on the used car lot.
Yeah.
Right. And that was my first job. I remember my dad saying, "You're going to go do that." I don't want to go out and it's like Central Valley. It was 100 and some degrees. And I was out there washing cars. And I'll never forget the boss came out and just got in my face. I didn't even know really what I did. He yelled at me and I was absolutely crushed. And I look back on that now and think that was good for me.
Yeah.
Like washing cars, doing those kinds of things. And I love the point in your book. We have that front end of that young age, 16 to 25. They're not working. They haven't been taught how. They haven't been taught how to work. They haven't been taught how to take. What do you do for a work-life balance? How do you, that was great. I laughed when I read that in the books, and how you deal with like this new generation that comes to you that has all of these, what do you say? I don't want to.
Infantilizing ideas of adulthood. That issue of these young jobs is, you guys have to deal with masculinity-crisis in the pulpits. There's a ton of attention to it right now in the broader world. The left is all concerned about it now because they're worried that kind of disgruntled masculine issue led to a lot of success for President Trump in the election, these big popular podcasts with Rogan and these guys. How many people have you ever heard say that the death of teenage employment has contributed to the masculinity crisis?
Yeah.
I've never heard it come up. But I want to know who the 23-year-old is who gets out of school, who's equipped for their first job, who never worked a part-time job in high school or college. I just don't believe it's possible. That you never learned how to get yelled at by a boss, or how to deal with criticism, or to show up on time, or get along with coworkers, or to not think it's fundamentally unfair that you and your coworker get paid the same when you work harder than the coworker. Like, I'm sorry, that's life.
That's life.
But you don't know that until you're at the movie theater or the car wash. And so those types of things, I think, have contributed to a real ill-preparedness for young adults.
Yeah. I think this is important. This is something we need to think about, the importance, even as a young pastor. You know, churches taking in young pastors. It's
well, we've seen it with interns, young guys who just aren't prepared.
They're just not.
But I think it's a little less pastoral, I'm about to say, and a little more in the policymaking realm. But how are you going to get more teenage employment if they want a $22 an hour minimum wage at McDonald's?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And coming back to the pastor thing and interns and those going into ministry, there's an entitlement to, I'm going to choose the pulpit I want, where I want to go, the financial situation that I want. And what a shift that has been from when I first went in, which was 2004. And I said, I'll be glad just to get a call.
Well, and that domain that you guys have to see, and I know it's systemic, and I do talk to other pastors about it. And even though you're a few years younger than me, we're more or less same generation. But like, you have my support on that one in a way you can't even believe, because my dad went in 1974, and he was 24 when he was ordained. And the dues paying that he had to do versus the dues paying that some young ministers now. I don't want to get into specific denominations and things, but like when people talk about raising the money to plant a church, and they're talking about dollars and ideas that like I didn't even know existed. And it used to just, there was none of that support. So I think a lot of people, and again, I don't want to sound like the whole grandpa running up the hill both ways, all that stuff. But there is a different level of sacrifice expected these days.
So to close out the discussion on the book, and Dan and I were thinking it would be really helpful. What advice for young men starting out in their vocation, pre-marriage, post-marriage, pre-children, and then for men with children? Any advice you want to give? I think that would be really helpful.
Well, I think
it's a big question.
I think that there are different applications at each of those stages, and the fundamental principles underlying them are the things in the book. They're theological. Reread Genesis 1. Connect yourself to the idea that being an image bearer of God is a commandment to co-creation, understanding the beauty of what that means. Try very hard, and bring your spouse in on this, to never say in front of your children that you work so they can have food on the table. Because they need to know that they have food on the table because you work, but they also need to know that that's not why you work. That you work and it puts food on the table, but you're working because you're doing what God created you to do. And it's very difficult for a young person to appreciate that nuance if you're constantly holding it over them. I worked all day, eat your dinner, where it's going to make them resent work.
Yeah.
And I think the boomers did that to millennials. I really do. And so there's a lot of practical things I think that way. I guess you brought up that work. Don't ever say the word work-life balance in a job interview. and if you do, don't interview with me. And I pay very, very, very well. And I'm telling you, you're not going to get a job with me if I hear those words.
And any guys who want to intern at Escondido URC or Christ Reformed in Anaheim, no work-life balance for you.
And also don't, for young professionals, if your company has an opportunity to work from home, don't take it. Go to the office.
I loved you said, be present. Be present.
You're going to go work your, off all day, do good things, and no one's going to see it.
Yeah.
And you think that's going to be good for your mobility, your vertical mobility. Be seen, be present, be mentored, find someone who's been around a little bit to show you the way.
Yeah. And be likable.
Yeah.
So many people are just miserable to be around.
Totally.
Even if they're tremendous workers, if you can't stand to be around them, you can't have people like that.
Yeah. That's a great point.
And then to think about what you're doing, you're serving others, right? And that's a distinctively Christian characteristic and quality that Christ pushed us to all the time. So.
And I hope that was okay even for you guys that I did quote Pope John Paul II in making that point. But that it was such a beautiful encyclical that I quoted from, where he talks about you being the subject of work. Right. As a worker, and that you are extending your work towards an object, and that this idea of work as a transitive activity, that is, I think, in Catholic social thought, but it's something that is very ecumenical. You're serving others in your work, and if you believe theologically that God cares about you as the worker and cares about the person who's being served in the work, then you have to believe God cares about the work that is between the subject and the object.
Yeah. Well, with common grace, even the Pope swerves into the truth every now and then.
All right. Let's talk a little bit of Christian nationalism and end on a few comments about your father. Does that sound good?
Sure, as long as those are two totally separate discussions.
Well, that's what I want.
Unless somebody wants to use AI to come up with a time that Greg-Bahnsen said he was a Christian nationalist, I will save you the time. It's not going to happen.
Okay.
You're not going to find it.
All right. So I guess you have some thoughts about the current CN movement.
The past CN movement. Is there still a CN movement?
I think it's dying.
Well,
I think it's dead.
One thing we've discussed is, where do you think it is now after Trump's election? Because it seems to us that was the worst thing that can happen to them.
It certainly was. It always is.
Because they don't have the fear anymore.
It always is for people who have made up a messianic view of politics. You need to always be in the minority.
Yeah.
Even just as a business model standpoint, not getting to the distinctives, what I really believe is a sociological movement in CN. I don't think it was ever theologically serious. But, where subscriptions, where was MSNBC's ratings the highest was, in the Trump campaign, being the resistance against it. When Bill Clinton was elected, I'm on the board at National Review. I've been a lifetime Bill Buckley conservative. That was the heyday for Christian media, pre-cable social media, but the magazines, subscriptions were highest.
Well, that's when Rush Limbaugh exploded,
exactly.
that era.
It created the talk radio movement. So there's a sense in which just now be careful what you wish for, because, and by the way, Elon buying Twitter. The whole thing a few years ago was post-liberal dogma was centered on the idea that a free society didn't work, that we couldn't accomplish things, and we need now state power. And then because big tech is holding us down, and then market forces brought back free speech at Twitter, and a free election, created supposedly this guy they wanted, winning and losing and then winning again and all this stuff. So in other words, they kind of had some inconvenient successes over in that world. But where do I think it is? I think it is, it never had a chance of being a serious movement because it was never intellectually serious. And it was certainly never theologically serious. The thing I want to say for my dear friend Doug Wilson is I do not equate his view of Christian nationalism with what your other guest you had, Stephen Wolfe, and some of his friends.
It's different.
I think that Doug's, and I've talked about this 100 times with him, and he and I have put it all out there together, and on some occasions made it public on social media. My disagreement is in him choosing to call something Christian nationalism that I don't believe is called Christian nationalism. So I believe in Christian schools, having this sort of vision. I'm a postmillennialist, and that I have a Kuyperian view of lordship of Christ, and I don't think that has anything to do with Christian nationalism. And I think it is from a marketing standpoint, but from a theological standpoint, it was very wrongly named Christian nationalism.
This is the tie. You said, how could we tie all this together? Here's your tie. It's the kind of people the movement is creating. And of young men, I think I put up some kind of comment and you responded to it. It's created this culture, a subculture of angry young men who are not productive at all on society. They're sitting around in the comment sections of YouTube all day long, arguing and fighting about something in principle.
Now, do you mean it that it created it or it revealed it?
Probably it revealed. I think that's probably more accurate.
There's a negative feedback loop.
There's a loop there, and I guess that would be the tie. This has been unhealthy. What we're dealing with is theory and people who are unproductive to actually go out and make any kind of difference in that certain segment.
That's where I think the semantics matter so much to me. I believe in Christian nations. I believe in probably a somewhat different view of the Great Commission that way than I understand you do. But like an Andrew Sandlin, Doug Wilson, David-Bahnsen are all on the same page on wanting this robust view of a Christian culture.
Sure.
What you're describing has no theology of a Christian culture.
No.
It is a protest movement that had absolutely zero chance ever of not being attached to ethno-nationalism. And by definition, Christian nationalism and Christian nations are not the same thing, because I'm basically saying, now look, in my embodied context, I'm an American. I love America to more honor God and kiss the sun, lest it be angry. But I do want that for Greece and, yes, even Uganda. And therefore, what I'm advocating for is a whole bunch of different nations of different, and we in our country are a melting pot of various different ethnicities and whatnot. So there's this ethnic aspect and kinist undertone that has over time been revealed to what I and many others believed was always going to come out, that there was heavy anti-Semitic.
It's moved. It's showed its cards.
But they're not really trying that hard anymore not to.
Right.
And I think
that's a selling point, sadly, for many.
For a lot of the younger ones.
Yeah.
But I think that it comes from a disgruntled, unproductive sociological disposition.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the reasons I've never been able to get as animated by this as some of my friends have. I have friends that are kind of not only very dear personal friends, but really pretty compatible with me theologically, that are really worried and know all these guys and their names and everything. And I pay very little attention to any of it because I don't take them very seriously. Yeah. First of all, they're not really all that bright intellectually.
I agree. Yeah.
And very underwhelming. And that was the piece that was kind of surprise to me, because a couple of them, and you had one of him as a guest in your podcast, loves promoting his own intellectual background. And it was just like the book was such a disappointment in terms of its seriousness and gravitas. But then the part you're referring to, all the fans out there. I think that if there were healthier business lives, work lives, marriages, church lives, this thing would be much less attractive.
Yeah, it's what I asked. What are you actually doing?
Well, it's
nothing.
It's difficult to get successful, contented people to be revolutionaries. That's what they need.
Yeah,
and that is a historical fact about the difference between the French and American Revolution.
Yep,
American Revolution was rooted in people who were very productive, and the French Revolution, they were not only God-hating, they were not productive people.
Yep.
It's a movement that has fed off the idleness we just discussed.
That's exactly right. So that is a really good connection point.
It's a movement that's fed off that.
I don't think there's going to be a lot of people out there who say, David, I read your book full time. I loved it. By the way, I'm a card-carrying CN. I don't think those two things are going to go together. And that's not just because they don't like me. Yeah. I think it's because those messages are somewhat incompatible.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for commenting on that. I think you bring...
Now, where does Greg-Bahnsen... Oh, you're going to that.
I was going to say... No, I was not going to tie that together.
Okay.
I mean, I might say, it's obvious that there's an undermining of your father's work in some of this, I think, stuff. But
it's not two different things. Just like, I think Wilson would say he has a Bahnsenian view of this, and he's calling it Christian nationalism. And then Wolf would say this is a anti-Bahnsen thing. So
I think that's right.
But that's one of the ways, just like I knew the theonomy movement would never last. You can't be around this stuff for as long as I have and see the splintering and the inability to build any sustained institutions or friendships, for that matter. Forget institutions, just friendships that last.
Wow. Yeah.
And believe it has staying power.
Yeah.
So you're going to get to a point where even the like explicit racist, kinist, and anti-Semites are going to turn on each other pretty soon.
Oh, they've all been fighting.
Yep.
I mean,
with each other.
Oh yeah,
they turn their guns on each other.
They don't get along. It's interesting. Just it's kind of what Jesus said. Let these people go. Do what they're going to do.
Yeah, let them fight.
They're both going to fall in the ditch. So
I'm pretty much with you there, and that's a good thing in the sense that it means I don't have to devote a lot of resources taking that seriously. Yeah. But I do hear people all the time say, "What are we going to do?" They have such an audience. They're really and not even just in my own reform world, but like really good friends of mine at Christianity Today are like, what is your thought on this whole thing? And I say to them, I don't take it seriously. And they say, well, don't you see what's going on Twitter? I go, I absolutely do not see what's going on Twitter.
That's not real life.
That's what the job is for.
They're loud and obnoxious online. So it gives a perception that it's bigger than what it is.
Well, and that's, by the way, from a political campaign standpoint, this is a wonderful way to lose an election, to not understand the online dynamics. Now, I'm sure it's true, too. You can underestimate what online data tells you. Yeah. But the online, like the idea that Twitter is not real life, the people are going to learn that the hard way. Yeah. And this is where that expression I use almost every day. I talk to my kids all the time about it. Go put your feet in some grass.
Yeah. Ground yourself. So, okay. Just one last question. Tell us about your dad a little bit. Like, just tell us about him. Again, I mentioned at the beginning the visual of him working, but I never, I've read him, but I never knew him. I know I was just talking with Bob Godfrey, and he said your dad was a very, very sharp man. So just tell us a little bit about him to close this out.
Yeah, most of the people that didn't like him would say that, I think. And then
I don't think Bob disliked him.
No, I'm not putting Bob there at all. Yeah. I think that that Bob Godfrey and my dad would have had an awful lot of respect for one another for very good reason. They both should respect each other tremendously, and I hold Godfrey in very high regard. And I think when I got to read through my dad's files of correspondence, it was all, this wasn't on Dropbox or the cloud. Like, he had filing cabinets and that were entrusted to me. And when I went through all his correspondence in the years after he died, it was somewhat cathartic. That was one thing that stuck out to me, is the way in which some people he had public theological disagreements with, how cordial and civil they were to each other.
Wow.
And how much the other person respected my dad. And, R.C. Sr. And my dad debated on apologetical method. Yeah. But they were both Reformed pastor guys, and they didn't ever have a public spout or whatever. They had disagreement on apologetics. But I had for years and years framed up in my home office. R.C. had signed a book he had written after my dad died for me, saying, "With warm regards for the splendid work of your brilliant father." And I read it every single day for years and years. And this was because he was respected by his colleagues that way. He was, we've already talked about, he's an incredibly hardworking guy, a lot of joy in his work. But where a lot of people would be most surprised is how normal he was. And that's the thing that I just can't believe. I'll have someone come up to me, I can tell by their age, they weren't born yet when he died. And they're saying, your dad changed my life. And I'm like, well, how old are you? I'm 26. I'm like, well, he's been dead 29 years. So let me do the math here. But so they mean they know him from audio sermons or reading books. But when I bring up that he never listened to a Christian music record once in his life, hated it.
Because he's a smart man.
Yeah. But he was a Beatles fanatic.
Yeah, good.
And that we never missed an episode of Saturday Night Live together. He loved Saturday Night Live. And so we'd fight because I was in high school in the real golden years, as you guys would know. Right. The Adam Sandler and Phil Hartman, Dana Carvey and all this. And he just loved the old days.
He's an original cast guy?
Bill Murray and Chevy Chase. But see, that's what I learned. Most people, it's the nostalgia of high school. So you can always tell when someone went to high school by what their favorite era of Saturday Night Live was.
Even Lorne Michaels says that. When you're like 14, that's your cast.
Lorne Michaels said it, and I've held on to it. And my dad was very much a byproduct of Saturday Night Live. He loved the Beatles. He loved that element of pop culture. So, that movement that a lot of people associate him with. There was one guy who published a lot of my dad's books named Gary North, who was in Tyler, Texas. There was another guy who was a huge influence on my dad in high school. Named R.J. Rushdoony. He was in Vallecito, California. My dad was in Los Angeles, and when he came back from Jackson, Mississippi, and he planted a church in Orange County. So he was just sociologically very different than some of the others that in that theological world he came from. So that's what I mean by normal.
Well, one thing we just mentioned, we re-listened to the Great Debate, and I was telling Chris the other day, one thing that comes across, obviously brilliant, his brain power could have lit up Las Vegas, but he was funny. He's cracking jokes in the debate as poor Stein is just drowning.
Well, his funniest one in the debate was not meant to be a joke about the laws of logic. Stein sort of walked into that one, but there were other moments of
live by faith.
Hilarious. Well, and even that's sort of a double entendre of both very serious and humor.
Right.
But he was very clever.
Yeah.
But here's the piece that I will say that I don't get a chance to talk about very much. I wish he had devoted his whole public ministry to apologetics. He cared deeply about a Christian view of ethics. And I think ultimately associations with that world got in the way of his apologetical legacy. I don't think he did something theologically wrong, but I think in hindsight, where this world was going to go in pop apologetics a few years after he died could have never been known. But it was one of the most depressing things I went through, seeing Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris write books that sold 1 million copies about atheism and seeing the Christian counters to those things. Yeah. It was just embarrassing.
Yeah, right.
And we needed Greg-Bahnsen then, and I don't believe we deserved him.
Can you imagine, had he been around to take on the new atheists, that would have been...
It would have been a blessing.
It would have been something.
Fantastic.
Yeah. But yeah, so and just as a father, he was just a very, very involved father.
So what's he like at the dinner table? You're not discussing,
For one thing, he loved the food. Let's start with that.
You're not having, intricate philosophical conversations at the table?
All the time. Yeah. All the time. My teenage years in particular, we spent a lot of time talking theology and all that stuff. So, but then also a lot of fun. I mean, he went to every sports game. I was very into basketball. He came to all the games. My mom was gone throughout my high school years, and so my dad was a single dad with 4 kids, and he was very, very involved.
Wow.
But those dinners were, well, let's put it this way: if my dad and I went out to dinner, there was a lot of theology and stuff and arguing, back and forth. Because
you took him on?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay.
Arguing implies a winner and a loser, and I was not the winner of those arguments. But I tried. Yeah. But it wasn't because he was a better bully. He was just so thorough and logical. Yeah. Wow. But then very fun. We would go to Hawaii on family vacation. We go to Lake Tahoe on vacation. And then there was just a lot of really good times. So
what did he do for fun? I mean, other than
work? He loved reading. He just read.
Yeah. No, like hobbies? He played sports? What?
No, his health was not such by the stage of his life that he was able to. He would try going on long walks. The cardiologist, he had a broken heart, and that's what ended up taking him. But he couldn't do a lot of the exercise stuff. But he went to Westmont on a tennis scholarship.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he was a big tennis player. He'd been student body president at his high school in Los Angeles. And so, when he was younger and healthier, he was more athletic, but he couldn't do a lot of that stuff. And the other thing I say about his books is he loved movies.
Wow.
And he went to movies by himself a lot when my mom was gone. He loved going to movies. Yeah.
What were some of his favorite movies?
He never missed like Grisham was doing those movies was it Pelican Brief,
The Firm,
and all that. Yeah. He always was a big James Bond movie guy. Everyone, and so I think there's been like how many James Bonds since my dad died? A bunch. But he was always in that debate about Sean Connery versus Roger Moore. Whatever. Yeah. He was a big Sean Connery guy. Yeah. So he loved movies and he loved dining. And that was where my dad and I spent a lot of bonding time together, just going out to eat.
Was he a cook?
Not really. He liked to barbecue. He got on the grill, but not in the kitchen. Didn't cook much. Yeah. So his view of cooking was throwing a ribeye on a grill in a backyard.
I like him even more.
Yeah.
My wife, when I cook, she always complains, I cook meat on plate. That's what she calls it. Yeah. Just a steak on a plate. I don't even need vegetables.
You know what? It's the healthiest thing you can eat anyway.
Amen.
Well, thanks for telling us about him. Yeah. I lost my dad later than you. You were 21. Yeah. It's life altering.
It is.
It's life altering. And, but then I realized, like you've realized, the blessing of having a good father, and, praise God for that.
Yeah. And I think that, I talked about this when we met up last time. I think that there's, nothing like a guy having a good relationship with their father. Yeah. And I'm blessed that I had that, and you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. Well, thanks, David, for coming on today. What a blessing. Thanks for making the way to Escondido. A lot of people don't want to come to Escondido, but you braved it through the rain today. So thank you for coming, and also thank you for modeling charitably discourse with even those you disagree. I think that's a really good witness. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, David.